Professor John Jackson, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. It's been too long since we've had the time to talk with you. And the Paul Simon Institute just put out a new poll getting voters' attitudes on a number of issues. One of the ones we especially wish to talk to you about was the poll that you took on whether or not voters would want to add an amendment to the Constitution of Illinois that would allow us to move from a flat income tax to a progressive tax. And of course, that's the really big issue the governor is pushing this year. He says we need that $3 billion, he estimates, in additional revenue that would bring into the state. What can you tell us as far as what you found out during your poll?
Well, this is indeed the big issue in terms of policy on the fall ballot. We'll be voting on this, of course, in November. There will be a lot of money spent on each side between now and then, but the baseline is the proposition starts with about 2-to-1 in favor of doing that. It's 65% in favor and 32% against. So that's a pretty good baseline to start from. And that's, of course, where the campaign will take off from, and we'll see who's got the most money and who's got the best television and who mounts the best campaign. But right now, those in favor have a decided edge.
Can I ask you, before we get into some of the actual numbers, when you did this poll, how was it conducted? Was it just in Southern Illinois? Was it across the state, or just how did you do that?
No, it's a statewide poll. We have a sample of all areas of the state. We include Chicago, suburban Chicago, and downstate all.
And as before we bring up a graphic we have, there's another issue that's also on this graph, and it's the millionaire's tax. What is behind that information? What is the millionaire's tax?
Well, you may remember that the Democrats put this on the general election ballot in 2014, and they wanted a referendum on taxing those, putting a 3% surtax on those who have an adjusted gross income of $1 million a year and above. It passed then rather handily. About 2-to-1, and it's still very popular today. In fact, it's a little bit more popular, 68%, I believe, in favor of this tax. And it is a component of the graduated income tax, because the governor's proposal, of course, as you know, hits those above $1 million much more heavily than those but below $250,000 in income per year.
Yeah, with the taxes as the governor proposed, no one would pay more in income tax at this time, at least according to the initial brackets the governor has. No one would pay more until they made $250,000 or more, and then the brackets go above. There's a slight income tax deduction or lowering of the brackets for those at the lower income level.
Right, right, that's correct. And then between $250,000 and $1 million, there is a gradual progressive income increase, an income tax increase up to the $1 million and above, which I believe goes to 7.99, if I remember correctly.
So let me bring up a graphic that shows who was in favor and who wasn't on both the millionaire's tax, which is not going to be on the ballot, but it's nonetheless kind of interesting to see, and the progressive tax.
That gives you good longitudinal data. We've asked the same two questions over and over again for those 6 surveys between 2015 and 2020, and it's been pretty steady. And in all cases, the millionaire's tax outdraws the progressive income tax, but not by much. And in all of those cases, the approval rate is well above 60%.
Interesting to see that, and it's just over 60% in favor. To remind the voters, what What percent do we need to pass a constitutional amendment?
Well, it's currently at 65, but you've got to get to 60% of those voting on the referendum item. And the alternative is to get to 50% plus one of all of those voting in the general election. So there are two different ways in which it could pass.
I believe in your polling, it was a yes/no. Wasn't that how you posed the question? Are you in favor or not of a progressive income tax?
It was strongly in favor, opposed, or strongly opposed.
Okay. And did you hear any, or did you do any polling on people? Some people would say if we have a progressive income tax, that's going to drive some of the higher income people, who often are the employers, out of the state. Did you do any questioning on that, or get any feedback on that or not?
No, not really. We didn't pose that question, although the millionaire's tax to some extent taps into that same possibility. The critics, of course, have said that, and nevertheless, almost 70% are in favor. Well, I think so. I didn't mention, but when we do the crosstabs, which we did by area, for example, we had Central City Chicago, suburban Chicago, and the collar counties, and then the other 96 counties called downstate. Every one of them was well over a majority. Chicago Central City was 73%, the suburbs were 68%. Even downstate was 55% either approve or either favor or strongly favor. And then when you go to party, when we control for party, not surprisingly, the Democrats are most in favor. They're at 83% approved. The independents are at 59%. But even, and I think surprisingly, the Republican support is I think higher than I expected. This Republican support is 41 and the opposition is 55. So obviously the Republicans are the most opposed, but even there, I thought the margin was not what you might expect.
And of course, we really haven't had as yet, I presume, and I think you agree, that we're going to have a lot of advertising going back and forth, both in favor of the tax and opposed to it. Certainly, Governor Pritzker, with his deep pockets, can spend quite a lot of money trying to convince us this is something we need as a state. But I wonder how this will, are you going to do any further polling, do you think, on this issue between now and November when the vote comes in?
Well, probably not, but you're certainly on to something, and that is the opponents will take a toll on these numbers. They'll probably go down, although the proponents, the governor and his campaign, will do everything they can to keep it where it is, because right now it would pass comfortably. So this is a kind of a natural experiment where you see exactly the impact of a campaign. We've got a baseline here, and we'll know on November 3rd or November 4th how much that campaign and how much all that television and all those Facebook ads and newspaper ads have an impact, and whether the impact goes one way or the other, or perhaps all that money spent will just cancel one another out. That's the other hypothesis about campaigns. If both sides spend tens of millions of dollars, maybe it won't matter, and the campaign will essentially have been for nothing.
I don't know,
except spending a lot of money.
Yeah, well, it'll help the TV stations, right?
It will indeed.
I don't know if you know this, and I don't mean to trip you up, but have you ever looked at the? I think Illinois is one of only a handful of states that still has a flat tax. Is there any correlation between those states that have a progressive tax and financial stability or balanced budgets? Is there some evidence that if we passed a progressive tax, it would indeed help the state's financial problems?
Well, almost all states have a progressive tax if they have an income tax at all, so that's really hard to say. I think there are only 3 states, maybe 4 states at the most, that have a flat tax. So it's really a little hard to say that the progressive income tax has an impact either way, because you can find healthy states and not so healthy states in terms of their finances on both sides if most of them use the progressive tax, which they do. The brackets on our proposed tax are not really very different from what the range is for most states. It's certainly sort of in the middle of that usual range.
Let me, if I might, you had another question on the poll, and we have a graphic on that, whether you favor or oppose an extra 3% state tax on all incomes above $1 million. Again, it's just maybe another version of the millionaire's tax, I suppose.
Right.
And so we can see, and you strongly, the largest area is strongly favor and somewhat favor. So those are the greens. Strongly is dark green, and the somewhat favor is light green. So again, it doesn't look good if you're a millionaire and you want to keep more of your money. There might be an extra 3%.
Well, let me just correct a bit. It's not if you're a millionaire, it's if you make adjusted gross income of $1 million a year. I think that's mostly the billionaire class, is it not? If you're a millionaire, you're not making $1 million a year.
Because of deductions, you mean? Because of the deductions that you would take? Well,
really, income of $1 million a year, you've got to have a lot of money to be making that much for your one single year income.
Right. Well, yeah. And it wouldn't impact. It would impact just only a relatively small percentage of our population.
Yes, that's what little research on this I've seen indicates.
Was there anything that you found that was surprising in the poll that you didn't expect, or did it more or less go along with as you expected?
Well, we've been doing this since 2015, so it's been pretty steady and pretty stable, not a lot of surprises, but I must say, I thought as much conversation as we've already had in this state, and as many opinion leaders and public officials that have already talked about this, the governor hit it really hard in his budget message. I thought the needle would have moved more and probably would have moved downward more because of that conversation, that dialogue that's already taking place. Been a lot of attacks on this. Every single member of the General Assembly who's a Republican, I believe, has come out against it. It's clearly a partisan issue, so I thought that negativism would have probably had a bigger impact. Right now, it tends to show continuity across all of those 6 polls that we've taken since 2015.
Before we close out, do you have any other polls in the works as we go through this election year?
Not presently. We're still trying to get this one out and trying to make some sense out of a kind of a mountain of data that we've gathered.
And as far as the mechanics of the poll, how many people were interviewed, and what is the plus or minus margin of error?
We have 1,000 respondents statewide, plus or minus 3.1.
Is it, by the way, we used to do these with landlines, and very few people have landlines anymore. How do you reach people these days?
Well, that's exactly right. We have now gone to 60% cell phones and 40% landlines for exactly the reason that you indicated.
I'm almost surprised that people, I guess businesses have landlines, but I'm almost surprised people do. Well, Professor, again, thank you so much for joining us. It's always good to hear what you're all up to at the Paul Simon Institute. We wish you well, and hopefully we can do this again on some other issues throughout the year.
Thank you, Terry. It's good to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.